Welcome, everybody, to today's solar grazing webinar. We're going to do a little introduction to solar grazing in Nebraska, and we have a few speakers with us today. We have with us today Cameron Meyerly from the American Land Board, and he's going to talk about the business case for vegetation management, kind of an introduction to grazing under solar. And then we have Eric Bronson from James River Grazing, and James is going to talk about some of his experiences with the grazing contracts he has in Virginia. Really, what we're talking about today is we think about grazing the sheep, and that's the key piece of what we're talking about today. But really, this is the practice of using livestock to control the vegetation under the solar so it doesn't become a problem for the solar. And so vegetation management could be done by mowing, but we're talking about adding this sheep element or this grazing element into that management. Solar Nebraska really is an up-and-coming piece of our energy system. There's a lot of proposed projects in Nebraska. This is just a kind of a short list that is up on the Southwest Power Pool Generation Interconnection Queue dashboard. And so they're showing about 18,000 acres of solar and about 6,000 acres of solar with batteries. And so these sites are spread across Nebraska. This is not a comprehensive list of the proposed projects, but is a list of the ones that have interconnection queue, have made it into the interconnection queue with the Southwest Power Pool. So a lot of projects being proposed across the state, and more will be proposed in the future, and we'll see where these end up. But each of these will need vegetation management. So we can think about this site going in with I-beams driven into the ground and the solar installed above it. The state of the industry with solar is that the solar is one axis tracking, facing east in the morning, and then following the sun across the sky facing west in the evening. And with those I-beams being about 10 to 15 feet apart between posts. So you have these long north and south rows of solar panels, and then there is space in between, and then there is vegetation growing all across that, because that's going to be the lowest cost management, is to have that perennial vegetation. One axis tracking does pretty well, and I want to compare that to fixed tilt. And so the reason one axis tracking is the norm is this extra production happening kind of in the morning and late afternoon compared to something that's fixed tilt. So the one model I ran had about a 11% increase in production, but again, that production can be valuable because of the time it's produced and the value of the electricity at that time. There's the norm in the industry is this one axis tracking. There's a lot of other ideas out there, including raising them up or putting them in vertical rows or different things like that. And so really the state of the industry is across that top, where we're doing some type of mowing, potentially some cropping. Definitely animal husbandry with sheep can work, but also pollinator plants or something like that. The ones on the bottom of this list are really kind of maybe future, and I'm going to say maybe because of the added costs of potentially doing that. And I just want to throw that out there. If we put these in vertical rows and just had them be vertically oriented, we can imagine that the management might actually be easier underneath, but the production is quite a bit lower. And so this is just a model where I did this this model with these vertical systems with the same size of an array, and you can see that its production is almost 30% lower. And so kind of important challenges to that type of a system. So my expectation is that this one axis tracking will be the norm in the future. And then let's hear about grazing under these systems. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to turn it over to Cameron.
Yeah, just
No,
want to appreciate or thank John for the invitation to come and speak. As he mentioned, have a position with the American Land Board as their director of sustainability. And one of the things that are areas of producer education we've focused on in the past year and are going to continue to focus on are areas where we see potential for growth in the U.S. sheep industry. And so one of those items being solar grazing and vegetation management, targeted grazing, not just under panel, but opportunities to put sheep in some places and increase inventory, and really increase the opportunity for sustainable business for our producers here in the U.S. So got the oh, maybe here. There we go. All right. Got a little bit of overview there on how those tracking panels work on that single axis, but ultimately we have to look at what's the demand. And where I'm located at today, the state of Ohio, I think we rank fourth or fifth in the US for what is projected for solar installation. Where I grew up just east of Columbus, we think about energy demand of Columbus and surrounding suburb. And by 2028, 2030, we're going to be using more electricity than New York City, which for me to wrap my head around that is really difficult. So we have a need for energy. We like to talk in agriculture about our need to produce more food and putting food on tables and zero hunger. Along with that, we have additional metrics that we have to hit by a certain timeline. Energy is one of those. We're dealing with an aging infrastructure on that energy transportation side of things, and it's region, but nationwide. One of having the need for the increase of energy data. So if you're on social media, you're surfing the web anytime, they're collecting those keystrokes and those movements, and they have to store it. And it's not free to store that information. The companies that are really pushing for this clean energy, Meta, Amazon, Verizon, etc., any of these tech companies that maybe have a carbon neutral plan in place, and some of those are coming up pretty quickly, are looking at that push for green energy, specifically solar. We have to think too. I don't know what the stats are for Nebraska, but here in Ohio, and I would assume in Nebraska, we're probably similar. Per acre of land, that sun is producing energy, and we as farmers and shepherds are capturing that energy in our crops, in our lambs that are consuming that forage or the feed stuff that we're raising, and it's about $225,000 per acre is what the sun produces annually. When you start to question, well, how do they afford to build these large utility scale sites? When you see those numbers, it starts to kind of line up and make a little bit more sense. They cannot capture all of that sunlight, but they're going to be out there and try to capture as much as they can. Ultimately, when we're looking at this graph, don't pay attention to the direction that it's going or what we're focusing on. That key down there at the bottom. There's some specific areas of solar, residential, rooftop type solar, commercial things we would see on top of warehouses, community scale, which depending on where you're at, definition can change, but 50 acres or less, 100 acres or less tends to be in that community scale solar. And then utility, what I like to think of as 100 acres or greater. And so that's really what we're going to focus on today is the utility side of things. There's opportunity on the community scale solar side of things for grazing, but really where we're seeing a lot of growth, and you can see that from the graph, is in that utility sector. Ultimately, when we think about the growth of installation, why are we seeing the boom now? Yes, we need energy, but as price to install has come down and the price to manufacture the technology has also reduced, it's a lot easier to build sites in a cost-effective manner. And so as those prices have come down, we see this increase in installation there on those blue bars. And solar grazing, you might hear megawatts. And solar industry talk, to kind of remind myself, is we throw around 100 watts. It's a lot of electricity that's being produced. We are in a power plant when we're operating inside these fences. And then more so from the grazing and vegetation management side of things, about 1 megawatt of energy production requires 6 acres of land. I believe that number's come down a little bit to right around 5.5. And as we see technology increase and the technologies on the panels, the efficiency of that sunlight collection, we're going to see fewer acres required to produce a megawatt of energy. So I wanted to pull in some information, some data here from SEIA, and they have these really nice solar spotlight kind of snapshots of statistics with where your state is at. And so when you think about Nebraska, 47th in total installed capacity. So kind of last to the party on this. As John was saying, is it something in the future that we're going to see increase? Yeah, I think you will. And it just depends on the government side of things and where the demand is. If you see increase, one of the interesting things I will tell you, 47th is not the lowest state that I've given a presentation like this to. I was down in Kansas and was shocked because to get to where I was going, past nothing but windmills the entire trip down to the location we were headed to, and they ranked 49th in total installed capacity. And so to me, it's kind of ironic. You've got a state that is committed to renewables and is second, I believe, in the country for wind energy production, but they're 49th in solar installed capacity. So, just because they've gone down that path of renewables doesn't mean they're gung ho for the next wave of it. So, again, I kind of second John's opinion that there is a future, and regardless of where that you rank nationally, I still want to see sheep under those panels, even if you have a couple of utility scale sites in the state. The other piece of data I wanted to share from the Solar Energy Industries Association is just a map of sites that are under development, under construction, operating. And we can see there in Nebraska, some on the east side, they're a little bit larger, definitely some in Colorado. And I think this is opportunity too, if you're kind of on those outer edges of the state and you want to get started with this, maybe you can't do it on that ground within that state border today. But there is opportunity outside of your state to get started and be ready to go when the time allows within the confines of your own state. Ultimately, agrivoltaics. What are we talking about? It's a big fancy word that fortunately now most people are familiar with. And when we think about agrivoltaics, there are really three main areas that we pair energy production with agriculture: crops, grazing, native habitats. And for me, I don't want you to go home and say, "Oh man, the guy from Land Board hates butterflies and pollinators, and he's anti-corn," because that's not the case. But we're focused on the sheep side of things, and we know. I guess I should say I'm focused on the sheep side of things. And there are certainly other agrivoltaic options out there. Right now, today, the one that fits and the one that's working, and we have proof of concept, has been solar grazing, and specifically with sheep. When we think about the greatest hurdle to sheep producers in the eastern United States, I like to throw in the western United States as well. It's access to grazable acres. The reason I pull in those western producers is if we start to talk about grazing of public land and Bureau of Land Management, all of a sudden we pull those away. Well, our western producers get pretty fired up pretty quickly. And so for the sheep industry as a whole, access to grazable acres is our largest hurdle, our greatest hurdle to the industry, both new producers and existing. When we think about the need, where does vegetation management come from? Why does the solar industry need us? And why can we partner alongside an industry that is not our own? We think about the goal of a solar panel: collect sunlight. Pretty straightforward. I'm not going to get into the details of how it works and why that's the case. But what's enemy number one to the ability to collect sunlight? Shade. If we create shade on a panel, We're not operating as efficiently as what we can. And as we talked about before, that here in Ohio, about $225,000 annually of energy being produced by the sun, can't capture it all. But if that panel is out there, we need it to collect as much as it possibly can so that those sites are profitable. Those sites, from a maintenance standpoint, don't have issues from shading. I've got a nice example here of a site that's been mismanaged, and someone has gone through and mowed in between panels. But what's the job at hand now that nobody wants? That's getting under those panels and weed eating. Highly labor to get to that point. Period. Yeah, this is a site that is not operating efficiently, not collecting energy or not collecting sunlight and producing energy efficiently. And so we can really get away from that if we have proper management first and foremost. Vegetation management is a vital part of the development planning. Companies know that when they're installing these panels, this is a long-term need. This is something that they're going to have to work around and work with and through for the 30 years, the 40 years that solar site is going to be there for. And so it's a long-term need. It's also an annual necessity. If your grass grows like ours does, and I'm pretty sure it does, it comes up every year. And if we cut it, it usually comes back a couple times, depending on precipitation and region and grass species. But this is something that vegetation management as a service is occurring for 30, 40 years, and it's happening on an annual basis. And a lot of times, multiple times throughout that year. So why grazing? Why sheep? When we look at grazing, the positives of grazing, we're minimizing the need for mowing, reducing labor, reducing emissions, kind of coining the term green on green. It has a really cool story, and it's something we in the sheep industry like to talk about. It's something that on the energy side of the equation, companies really like to talk about. Better yet, companies that are buying this electricity, that are investing in these installations, like to talk about this. It really comes full circle to that community aspect of hey, maybe we're tying up some ag land, but we're still producing a crop. We're still producing revenue for that agricultural sector. And so certainly in the permitting phase, we can improve that community acceptance. We're seeing, and I don't remember who had this data that was presented at RE Plus last year, that it's a known fact that if they have an agrivoltaics plan in place, the ease of getting that permitting to go through, regardless of state, is much easier. The ease is increased in those situations. So you may have some companies that want to take advantage of that. I like to find those companies, and the fun conversations are those companies that are doing it because they feel like it's the right thing to do. They are gaining that benefit of permitting, but ultimately they're doing it because they're passionate about it and they think it's correct in what they're pursuing. So why sheep? Again, a lot of other agrivoltaic options, opportunities that I think we're going to see in the future. But right now, they fit. They're smaller statured. They limit the wear on that infrastructure versus cattle, another grazing animal. And when we build a site specific for cattle, and it is being done in research projects, heavier gauge steel, lifting panels up higher off the ground. Right now, it does not pencil on the industry. And again, maybe as technology increases and materials get more affordable, we could see that. But today, sheep are a kind of common sense fit in vegetation management using agrivoltaics. Reduce liability with maintenance individuals. I don't know if anybody's probably at some point been trampled by a flock of sheep, but you don't hear about it on the news in terms of just worker safety. Those individuals that have to be in that site working with those electrical components, maintenance on the panel, risk of injury to those individuals much lower in a sheep situation. And then weed suppression through grazing. If you've operated sheep in a pasture with a lot of biodiversity in our plant species, you've seen the way they graze, and we don't need to just have a grass and clover situation where those animals will perform. One of the examples here, it's cornfield on the right hand side. I'm sorry, a bean field that had been interseeded with some other grass species, and then of course had some carryover weeds. And hopefully that video is playing. What you can see is instead of that U going right after that very palatable soybean, we're going straight for that more erect, taller growing weed species. Just a testament to their ability to browse in that environment. When we think of the business aspect and the potential for growth in the U.S. sheep industry, some of the numbers, and these are more Midwest to East numbers, and these are fully established sites, we're looking at 3 to 5 ewes per acre. I think it depends, especially, what I know about Nebraska really depends where you're at in the state on what those stocking rates are going to be on site. Some parts of your state, if you have a solar installation there, you might be at 1 ewe per acre, especially early on after that forage has been planted and you're in the establishment phase. You might be at half a ewe per acre. By year 3, maybe we're up to 2, 3, 4 ewes per acre to effectively manage that vegetation. Grazing passes, we're looking at 2 to 3. Again, these are averages. There are parts down southeast, we're looking at 4, 5, 6 passes, grazing events or mows. Parts of Nebraska, you might have 1 grazing event. We move over to California. I was just talking with a grazer over there that they're in a 1-pass system. They graze and then mow behind those sheep to clean up the site. But it allows them to cover a lot of area, a lot of acreage with a reasonable amount of sheep. We have to remember this is a service that we're offering. And so that company has a budget in place during the planning phase, during the development phase. And so they know that they're paying for this service. If they're not paying that sheep producer, they're paying a mowing company. And so really, I've been working hard at pushing that we don't need to cut the legs out of under each other as sheep producers. But if you want to find a competitor, it is the mowing company. And so approaching it from that point of view, we really need to figure out what is market value for mowing in our area. And then we're priced competitively with that. There's a lot of different views on that. And maybe Eric will get into that with some of their models and his situation. But we have a lot to offer from the PR side of things, from the soil improvement, ecology side of things. But ultimately, they're paying for the service. And so they're going to have it mowed or hopefully have it grazed in a hybrid model. So I wanted to provide an example just to work through here. If we have 500 acres of solar and average 4 ewes per acre, which for parts of Nebraska, it's going to be pretty high. If we can generate $350 an acre, right off the bat, my sheep operation is generating $175,000. Now, that is not free money. I am working and increasing my management costs to handle that. But this is something on the home farm, I cannot find this money. Nobody's paying me to graze my sheep on my home acreage. And if they are, I would love to talk to you because I'd like to find that opportunity. But if we're at 2,000 ewes, we can lamb out a 1.5 lamb crop, 150%. We're producing 3,000 lambs. We go to sell those lambs, 250,000 pounds of lamb now entering into our American food system. One of the exciting things that I think there's a lot of potential is, yes, we see an increase for lamb production. I also have an increased ability to maybe find a direct market. Can I find that restaurant? Can I find that grocery chain that now all of a sudden I have the lambs in the quantity to fulfill that order for that chain grocery store. So again, stacking opportunities within this. We just throw an average price of $1.70 a pound, 170 a hundredweight. Our lamb check is generating $408,000 total. We're over $500,000. And I'm not going to steal Eric's thunder with what do we do with that lamb check, and how do we develop that business and shape that business, because he's got some great comments on that. We look at the business model. How do you approach it? And there's more than one way to do this, and I'm not going to tell you which way is right and which way isn't going to work, because a lot of it is dependent on how you approach it. If we're operating a ewe flock, just traditional system where we're operating the ewes, lambing them out, and selling those lambs, we might own those ewes. I have to manage those sheep 365 days out of the year. I'm not going to tell you that you can't keep those ewes on site over winter. I think there's opportunity to overwinter some of these sheep with some very detailed management plans on soil health and just reducing risks to animal welfare with windbreaks and being able to feed on site. That exists. But it really is up to the company on whether they're willing to do that. And you have to remember, this is not your property. You can't just do whatever you want. And so the management on that side of things has to be really top notch if we're going to look at a year-round system in Nebraska, where you guys do get some winter and winter weather. Leased use. There are a number of people that are kind of pursuing this option where, can I find a neighbor or a larger scale producer that has the sheep? I don't need to source the sheep. Maybe I'm paying him a stipend per ewe to carry out that vegetation management. Maybe it's a even trade of, hey, we're going to take these ewes off of your home farm, graze them for 9 months, get them bred on site, return them back to you, and we'll be back next spring to pick them up and manage vegetation with them again. There's a lot of interest from this. A gentleman out of New Mexico, running about 4,000 ewes, was sending ewe lambs over to, was sending ewes over to West Texas and then continuing to raise up his ewe lambs in New Mexico, and was actually able to increase his ewe flock to about 6,000 sheep and grow that model in New Mexico. And was pretty frank, he's got a system that works, doesn't have an interest in solar grazing, but really excited that somebody else can take advantage of the opportunity, and it helps him grow his operation on the home farm. The lamb feeder aspect of things. Can we bring in some younger animals, have them consume some forage? When we think about forage consumption as a percentage of body weight, those lambs are smaller. They're not consuming the same amount of forage total on a dry matter basis as our ewes are going to. But can I find those animals, background those animals, get them into the feedlot or off through that sale avenue, and still not operate in a 365 system? Some of the things we need to look at: death loss percentage, trucking, where are those animals coming from? Ewe lamb development. Can we find another larger producer that has some ewe lambs that we can graze and either find a buyer for or return those back to him at the end of the year? And it's a seasonal approach to this, which I think has a lot of value, but also has a lot of risk involved on the lamb feeder side of things. Ultimately, when we look at the hybrid model or the vegetation management model of solar grazing, they exist in a graze only situation. So you'd only be responsible for the grazing. The majority of individuals that are going to advise you on this are going to tell you you want to mow and graze, because there are countless examples of stockpiling forage and that next pasture rotation getting mown in front of you by the company that has the mowing contract. Well, now I have these sheep. I had forage in front of them, ready to move those sheep, and it's just been clipped. And so now my feed for the next 60 days is gone. Well, if I'm the one operating the mower and designing how we're mowing, how we're managing vegetation with both sheep and mechanical means, I hold the power to set up those grazing paddocks and that allotment. Uh, Mowing can certainly be a tool. We have that spring flush of forage, and when we don't have enough sheep to consume all of that forage in the spring, and if I did stock it with sheep to manage all of that forage in the spring, come July, I'd be feeding hay. So can I clip some forage there in April, May, June, and then have some summer stockpile to come back to in July, August, and really just comes back to those stocking scenarios and uh, just being a savvy livestock manager. So it's a known management system for our solar companies. They understand mowing, they understand the companies that how they carry it out, and so I think a lot of it's peace of mind. You come in and you say, "Hey, we're grazing." If they've never seen grazing, they don't know what to expect. If you say, "Hey, we plan to graze 75% uh, and mow 25% of the time and clean up areas that the sheep are not doing a good enough job at controlling vegetation," it gives them peace of mind to know that, hey, they're going to be able to manage our vegetation because they have mowing equipment. And then certainly the upfront equipment costs that exists whether you're buying and use or um, those mechanical tools to get that job done. Wanted to cover real quickly opportunity for growth and why do we have this discussion. I'm getting a little tired when we're talking about solar grazing and maybe I'm at a township meeting here locally and somebody says, well, if you bring all these sheep in here, you're going to ruin my market at the local sale barn. And I get frustrated because we have sheep producers that would rather keep their $3 a pound lamb check than and import more foreign product than grow the U.S. industry and take a slight ding on that lamb check, how it exists today. We're importing about 60 to 70% of lamb that's consumed in the U.S. from New Zealand, Australia. UK was looking to capture another $45 million across a 5-year period. It's not just restaurant trade and grocery stores. We're impacting that non-traditional ethnic market as well, especially in the Northeast. And they're importing those carcasses in and selling in those avenues, just like they are into the restaurant and grocery model. So it's something that we as sheep producers in the U.S. have just come to accept. This 60 to 70%, that number will go up. We're seeing an uptick in lamb consumption, and if we don't produce more American lamb to put on the shelf next to this product, we're going to need to find it somewhere. And so right now we're finding the majority of it in those two countries. So just briefly, if you're not familiar with the American Lamb Board and the producer-facing site, it's lambboard.com. This is not the site with the recipes. I'm a big fan of the site with the recipes, but bigger fan of what I like to term the industry's best kept secret and the producer resources that are on the producer side of the organization. So check that out. And one of the things that we've really been focused on is producer education over the last 12 months. And one of those areas have been our in-person workshops. Was excited to have Eric come down and speak to our workshop down in North Carolina, and we'll be in 6 locations next year. We were in 3 this year, Texas, North Carolina, Pennsylvania. So yeah, if you have interest in this, these are ASGA certified events. So 2 days in the classroom, day of field day, hands-on work, and you receive that solar grazing certification at the end of that. And even if it's something that you say, yeah, this isn't for me, a lot of good sheep information in there as well. So we'd love to see you, and happy to take any questions now. And if you don't want to ask on the Zoom, cell number, email. Happy to answer those and reach out.
Great, Cameron. The ASGA is the American Solar Grazing Association. I put a link to that in the chat, so anybody who wants to have that, there's some resources there. We take a question now, maybe save the bulk of them for later, but go ahead and type those into the Q&A or the chat, and we'll get those talked about. Eric can start bringing his slides up, and love to see some of the neat pictures you have and hear about some of your experiences.
Yeah.
How are sheep protected from electrical lines and vice versa? Cameron, how about just get that as Eric is working on his?
Yeah, so all of that wire is encased, and one of the reasons why we have sheep on site and not goats, goats will jump up on panels and cause damage that way, and then also with that very specific browsing behavior, have an issue uh, with chewing on wires that we have not seen on in sheep grazed scenarios. So some you'll always have wires out there. Some situations you have wires buried, and so certainly would minimize the risk of chewing or access to those. Um, yeah, hopefully that helps.
Can you see that, John?
I can see, not yet.
Yeah, and I can answer these other two real quick before
Yeah,
we.
if you want to work on that, Eric,
Okay.
are you able to share your screen? Or are you struggling with
Yeah.
that?
So, how long do you typically see people putting sheep on a site before removing them? Really depends how large the site is. If I have 1,000 sheep and 10 acres, it's probably a day or two. If I have 1,000 acres and 200 sheep, I might be there for a very long time and may not be able to control the vegetation with that number of animals. So it comes back to a stocking situation and what you're able to do as a grazer, do that math. The other question here from John: are livestock guardian dogs a concern for facility damage? Um, I know that livestock guardian dogs are being utilized on, I'd say, the majority of sites. I think there are fewer sites that don't have a dog than ones that do. And I'm not aware of any facility damage aspects of that. Yes, these sites have a permanent fence around them, but that does not mean they are wildlife proof or coyote proof. And so to have that dog out there, I think is essential for protecting livestock. I have more concern about livestock guardian dogs and maintenance individuals, O&M personnel. And so I need dogs that are relatively friendly with strangers, but protect sheep from wildlife. And then John's got another question, and I'll wrap up with that one before Eric gets started. Can you cross fence? So really the best way that we're seeing management of vegetation is through intensive rotational grazing. And so cross fencing with some temporary wire is what I would say common practice. And moving those sheep from paddock to paddock that are temporary paddocks designed with polywire and reels is the norm. So with that, we'll pass it off to Eric and keep throwing those questions in the chat. We'll answer them here later.
Yeah, thanks, Cameron. Um, really glad to be here and really excited to kind of speak to a state that hasn't experienced a lot of solar development so far, and really excited to dig into this a little bit. And like Cameron mentioned, I always really appreciate the Q&A sessions in these education pieces. So please feel free, even if you might feel like it's a stupid question. I assure you, I asked plenty of stupid questions over the last 8 to 10 years. So I'm Eric Brunson, based here in Charles City, Virginia. I run James River Grazing Company, which is a vegetation management contracting company for utility scale solar. I always say we are sheep focused, and then we were forced into the mowing business. So um, I started James River Grazing Company back in 2016. And I've had the great opportunity to graze all over Virginia and North Carolina, and also had the opportunity to work in-house for an independent power provider that ran about a gigawatt of solar in between Virginia and North Carolina. So uh, I guess lucky enough to have been able to make all the mistakes over the past couple of years, and um, look forward to sharing a little bit about what we do and how we got to where we are now. So. Uh, I went to school at Montana State, studied animal science, and had the opportunity to learn about targeted grazing through some of Montana State's work with weed abatement using sheep, specifically leafy spurge and some of the thistle species. So I was familiar with it, but I primarily came from the cattle industry. I didn't have a tremendous amount of sheep experience. I mentioned, 2016, we kind of saw the writing on the wall here in Virginia that solar development was going to ramp up. And then in 2020, the state enacted a clean energy mandate. So there was a threshold that was set at the state level, which then accelerated solar development extremely rapidly, and it's continuing today. Right now, we only manage one site, one facility, but it's a 175 megawatt. It's about 2,000 acres. I know Cameron mentioned that kind of like 1 megawatt normally translates to 6 acres. One thing that you'll find is that the design of the sites could be very different given a lot of characteristics. For instance, here in Charles City, Virginia, a lot of wetlands, a lot of areas that the developer had to avoid. So that kind of drives that, if you're doing the math in your head and you're looking at 175 megawatts and it's that acreage doesn't pan out just right, there's a lot of what I call, dead space that's timberland, wetlands, not really usable for grazing. We focus on extensive scale management. Here in the East, we don't normally manage sheep in, something in a system that's similar to a range-based system where you might have more experience in Nebraska with that. So I kind of had to draw on my experience from Montana to grow into this scale of operation. So we've been lucky enough. The long-term asset owner, the solar company that we work with, we've worked with them now for about 3 years. They are very pro-grazing. I believe they just engaged a grazer in Nebraska for one of the first facilities that they built out there. So that's always a really important thing in solar grazing is, you're going to be working with the solar company that you contract with for, quite some time, hopefully. So those relationships are really important. Um, so what does it look like in practice? So, I mentioned our goal at James River Grazing is to try and do as much of that vegetation management that we can with sheep. Like, not only are we trying to prioritize lamb production to some extent, but um, you know, I don't think anybody uh, romanticizes about sitting on a zero-turn mower. So um, that's kind of our focus is let the sheep use as much as possible, and then the mowing is more of like a cleanup application. So prescribed grazing is the priority. Mechanical mowing is something that we have to provide. A lot of solar companies will engage the grazer. They don't want to have to sign two contracts. So if the grazer is able to provide that service, that's just another opportunity for you to stay in front of the solar company and another revenue stream. Um, Cameron mentioned, the selling point around solar grazing and the green on green and, all these kind of intangibles. And one thing I've tried to do anytime I engage with a solar company is, not just talk about managing vegetation, right? Um, that's in practice a really simple thing. But these sites, especially when we get into the larger utility scale sites, are full of habitat. Where we are in this part of Virginia, we've got bald eagles, we got wild turkeys. So I try and paint that picture, especially with a lot of these solar companies are facing a lot of resistance in the permitting phase. if you can talk about why grazing can help some of those other intangibles that are a selling point to the community where these facilities are being built, I think that's really important. Land stewardship. Most solar companies, they view these projects as, kind of the same way you would build a road, right? They're not living, breathing things with grass and trees and sunlight and soil and water and livestock. And so when we can paint that picture that, we're here to take care of the land, especially if they're going to be using it for 40 years, um, we want to care for it. We want to steward it. And I think that's something that a lot of solar companies don't have much experience with. And so when we can bring our experience from the agricultural community, what we know about managing landscapes, and trying to improve them, and use that to sell to the solar company, I think that's another selling point. All these bullet points here are kind of just the intangibles that I think, similar to Cameron's slide, paint the picture that we're an asset, beyond just the sheep and the zero turn mowers. So soil health, obviously, anytime we convert a land use in a large scale such as this, repairing, or in some cases rehabbing that soil over a 30 or 40-year time period, using uh, timed grazing is again a really big selling point, especially if that land might be returned to agriculture after the fact. One big thing that I really harp on with our long-term asset owners, we're a local resource. You are in the community. You are at the coffee shop. You're able to be kind of the forward face for a project, and I think that's a really important piece of kind of changing the narrative around these large utility scale sites, that it's not just a project. It is a, for lack of a better word, it's no different than any other ranch or operation in the area. So, and then problem solving, I think all of us as farmers and ranchers are used to problem solving, and being able to apply that to these situations, again, is another asset for these solar companies. So, um, I provide these bullet points just as a way for those getting into solar grazing to kind of think about this from the 30,000 foot view, as opposed to just trying to sell just the solar grazing. You're selling this full package of tools to those solar companies, and I think that's a really important selling point. So, and John, I'm gonna stop sharing here, and if anybody has any questions, we can jump into those, I guess.
Um, I invited Cameron. Yeah, thanks, Eric. That was excellent. I was muted for a second and I was talking but I invited Cameron Sword to come and join us, and she's from the National Renewable Energy Lab and is going to talk to us just really briefly about a grant opportunity. So as Cameron gets their slides up, we'll talk about a couple of questions. Let's start with the panels and their shade tend to favor cool season grasses. Does Eric or Cameron want to try to touch on that if you have any background? And you're both muted.
Yeah, I can start with it and we'll let Eric finish.
Go ahead.
It'd be interesting to hear, he's got some sites there in Virginia. One of the things we've seen, we've got a project through the Climate Smart Commodities uh, grant funds at ALB that we actually have a solar site that's a pilot site down in North Carolina. And when you examine that, just forage species between row versus what's under panel, we are seeing, without having the data finished, but some microclimates that do exist under panel that allow for some orchard grass, some clovers that in our normal pasture environment are not handling the heat in that UV exposure down in the southeast. And so you can't speak specifically to Nebraska, but that shading does have some value to certain species.
Great. Thank you. Um, Cameron, can you touch on lamb consumption in the United States and the trends on that?
Yeah, so if we look, I can't remember how many years ago, average consumption of lamb by the American consumer was right about a pound. Right now, we're up to 1.8. And so average consumption by individual is up. We are trending upward in consumption, primarily due to younger generations that are excited for food that has flavor and different than protein that they were raised on. So those millennial generations uh, have really done a lot for the consumption of land. And when we look at just kind of what those eating trends are, and it's a generational effect. And so we go back to World War II and where we saw that huge slump, and everybody's probably heard that story of these guys that were overseas consuming mutton cold out of a can. Can't really blame them for uh, having disdain towards lamb or mutton. But we're seeing kind of a swing back, and we're far enough removed from uh, those generational stigmas that it's improving consumption for our product.
All right, thank you. Let's hear from Cameron, and then we'll go and go question answers as long as we have time. So go ahead, Cameron.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, John, for the opportunity to be here and talk to you all for a few minutes today. My name is Cameron Sorg, and I work at the National Renewable Energy Lab here in Golden, Colorado. And I'm here today because we are offering over $8 million in prize funding from the U.S. Department of Energy to incentivize the development of some pilot projects for cattle agrivoltaics systems across the United States. So we're calling this prize the Large Animal and Solar System Operations, or LASSO prize. And unfortunately, I cannot take credit for that acronym. But I'll just give you a quick introduction to the prize. Cameron gave a really great introduction to agrivoltaics, and you saw in his and Eric's presentations how it's being done successfully and commercially right now with sheep. Sheep are relatively easy compared to cattle. There's definitely some challenges, but looking into the future, the Department of Energy is interested in seeing, is it actually feasible and economical to create these cattle agrivoltaics systems. So this prize program here works similarly to a grant, but it's a lot more flexible, and we'll have a phased approach that's first focused on building teams and partnerships, then your planning and development of the pilot sites with the solar arrays, and then eventually collecting data. I want to note that we do have two tracks to this prize. One is for those who already have existing sites. There's probably only a few of these in the US right now, but most of the funding and what most folks would be interested in is what we're calling our standard track. And so those are for anyone who's looking to develop new cattle agrivoltaics projects. A couple of more things to be aware of in terms of eligibility for the prize. So we're looking for projects that are ground mounted. So rooftop solar is not eligible. It's really important for agrivoltaics projects that the cattle have interaction with the solar PV array. So it has to be on the ground where the cattle herd is interacting with it. And we are also looking for systems that are at least 250 kilowatt DC. This is definitely on the smaller side and could offset your on-farm use, but we're also open to larger utility scale projects for this prize. I mentioned before that we'll have a phased approach. We're currently in phase one here, so we're looking for competitors to put together their teams, find solar developer partners, identify their site, and then there's a short submission package that is due in March. And then future phases will include the planning, design, and construction of your solar arrays. And then the third phase will be data collection. And that data that we'll be looking for will be focused on things like soil health, cattle health, O&M costs, energy production, all of those kinds of things. I'll just put this up really quickly. Everyone wants to know how much money's on the table for this. But for the standard track, if you move through the entire competition, meet all of your milestones, submit all of your data, you're eligible for up to $1.1 million in funding. And that's in addition to any kind of agreement that you work out with solar developer for lease of your land or anything that goes into that contract. So $1.1 million from the Department of Energy. And then finally here, I'll just leave you with a couple quick takeaways. The main thing I would suggest if you're interested in learning more, you can either scan this QR code or go to this link here. HeroX is our prize platform, and there you'll find a bunch of different resources for the prize. You can read the rules, which tells you everything you need to know. We have a teaming resource that you can fill out a form and put your information in saying, I'm a rancher or I'm a landowner and I'm interested in getting involved, and then help find connections with solar developers or others who are looking to be on your team. We also have some office hours and webinars available for you to find out more information and some technical assistance that will be provided. And then keep in mind the phase one submission date is March 6th, so you have about 3 months to put together your initial package. And then finally, I'll leave you here with this email address. If you have any questions, do feel free to reach out, lasso.prize@nrel.gov, and that will go to me and we can answer any questions that you have about this prize. But there are a lot of cattle in Nebraska, so we'd love to see some submissions from your state. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Cameron. I will be sending out a file that Cameron has shared with me that has some of that information. So if you copied some of that down, that's great. If you didn't, I will be sending it to you, and so you'll have that for your files or for future reference. And maybe we can get something going here in Nebraska. Let's finish up with some questions and work through some of these things. So. Eric, would you just highlight maybe your answer to the question on exterior fencing being wildlife friendly, so that the group can hear that, and then we'll go on to the next questions.
Yeah. So the question was about the perimeter fence being wildlife friendly. And so what we've seen in the industry is the change from the traditional chain link with the 3 strands of barbed wire on top to what the industry now calls wildlife friendly. So it's like an orchard type woven wire with the larger openings at the bottom. So it's installed upside down basically. And the smaller, 1 to 2 inch openings are at the top. And this allows things like box turtles and some of those ground dwelling species, but also allows coyotes and foxes and everything we don't want in there. But one thing I mentioned in the response is even on those chain link fenced facilities, that perimeter fence is never a 100% barrier. As we all know, predators are going to get where they want to get. And they're, even if the gates are close to the ground and everything is tight on the ground, there's still plenty of openings for predators. So, and one thing I will mention is outside of the perimeter fencing, wildlife can still get in and out of those those fenced areas. So even with the wildlife friendly fencing, we see deer inside the arrays frequently. I mentioned turkeys and bald eagles and bobwhite quail and all those things. So.
Very good. Another question came in: is there anyone working on smaller breeds of cattle that might do less damage from rubbing, or other species like llamas or alpacas? Have you heard of anything like that?
Yeah, I have heard a couple examples. I think everyone's, still in that evaluation phase with cattle specifically. And I like to use this period to talk a little bit about I think right now with cattle especially, and I'm really hopeful that the Lasso Prize program is going to help with this, with, whether it's the projects that are retrofitted or new projects, or if someone does some work around just, the research. And I think there is a large portion of the resistance to cattle grazing comes from the risk management industry for solar, the perception that, cattle are going to get in there and damage equipment extensively. I'll tell you, I grazed a site down close to the Outer Banks here in North Carolina, and I've seen that facility go through a couple of hurricanes with very minimal damage. I'm at times dubious that cattle would cause as much damage as we say, and or as we think. And so I think that's another kind of advantage for the agricultural community is to kind of be able to speak to our experience with cattle and hopefully allay some fears in the future. But not a lot of work done so far with smaller frame cattle.
Eric, I think your comment about the risk management industry is really important. That speaking with some of the developers, that the insurance industry is really dictating some of what can happen and what's acceptable and what's not, because they're clearly the ones that might have to pay if something were to go badly wrong. So, that it's a matter of this. Some of this research might be a matter of convincing them that this is acceptable. So that'll be interesting to see as we move forward. Again, I think we need to think about these things as vegetation management contracts, almost more than grazing contracts, and saying, okay, what are we trying to accomplish here is vegetation management for this solar, and that can be done in different ways. Whether it be with grazing or mowing or hybrid or something like that. So I think that, framing it as that vegetation management contract is helpful in my mind. Another question that came in is about rates and trying to be comfortable with a rate to, quote, force a vegetation management contract. And so what kind of ranges are currently being used for these grazing service contracts, or I might rephrase it, and what kind of rates for vegetation management contracts? And Cameron touched on that a little bit. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on the range?
Yeah, so that is, and I think that's a question that comes up every single time because it is just like any industry where is a competitive bidding process, price discovery is closely guarded from all directions, right? From those bidding on the contracts to the operators requesting those bids. So I've seen a big difference geographically. Here in the Southeast, everybody and their mother has a mowing company because we have a long growing season. Vegetation grows really quickly. So we kind of almost have this like industry in and of itself. It's the same people that are bidding those contracts for industrial parks or commercial buildings or, large government contracts are the same ones bidding on these utility scale facilities. So I think sometimes I know this isn't a great answer, but some of it is a little bit of luck or having a connection in that traditional mowing industry. I would venture a guess that Nebraska might be a little bit different because the mowing looks quite a bit different out there because the landscape's a little bit bigger, probably a lot more batwing bush hog mowing, that sort of thing than what we've got here with smaller equipment that can maneuver in these sites. So I think any method you would use to kind of go through price discovery in any competitive bidding process, you probably have to use just the same for these.
I'm gonna elaborate on that a little bit and then ask you to respond to my thought. One of the things in these vegetation management contracts will say something like we have to maintain under a certain height. And so in that process of trying to maintain that vegetation under a certain height, clearly the number of mowings and the timing of mowings is important. And that's where we would have some diversity between where you're at and here, but even here between the eastern half of the state and the western half of the state, where the eastern half might get 30 inches of rainfall and the western half might get 12, the number of mowings and the timing of mowings. So the vegetation management contracts range could change across those that geography because of just the amount of just even considering thinking about it from a mowing standpoint, I might not have to mow as many times in the west as I do the east, or in the case of sheep, I might not be able to run as many sheep per acre. I don't know, that might actually go the opposite because it's a similar amount of work. But well, how would you comment on that just a little bit, either Cameron or Eric?
Yeah, I think that is a good point, and I would maybe even build on that a little bit. One of the things when we bring, and this is kind of a lived experience for me, but when we bring solar grazing into the fold, um, you also have to remember that the solar company or the facility owner, whoever it is, probably doesn't have a lot of experience with grazing and forage management as opposed to vegetation management. So, that spec height, the specification height may be 12 inches, but you're also going to have to do a lot of education and fencing off. I think, and I'm talking about fencing off questions and people, not fencing off sheep about why we're doing what we're doing. So I think. Yeah, there is a large range and like you said, just within the state of Nebraska, we deal with the same thing here in Virginia to some extent, maybe less of a drastic difference, but it's really going to be more focused in a geographic region. So if you can find either a competitor or someone who's willing to share that data from your area, that's going to be most helpful.
Yeah, and I've heard that speaking with others that trying to educate the developer on what a grazed paddock looks like or a grazed system looks like versus a mowed system, and they look different. And we have to, and when we get our head around that, it really helps. Another question came in about using herbicides in addition to mowing and sheep, and then any comments on vegetation management beyond grazing, including crop or hay or things like that. So, any comments about those other potential models?
I can go ahead and start on the herbicide application. Depending on how that's being used, if it's being used for forage control around those piles or that supporting beam that's holding up that solar panel, some sites will allow it. Some companies will not. On the sites that we're managing, we have eliminated the need for spraying around those piles. We've eliminated the need to weed whack around those piles, which is something that, again, when you're doing some of that price discovery work and you might be getting some numbers on mowing, the follow-up question should be, well, what are you charging per acre to weed eat as well? Because again, as you can imagine the background, if you can see part of it or the pictures you've seen today, it is a job that I do not want. I will stock a site with more sheep to manage that vegetation around a pile before I will go out and weed eat. Spraying some fence lines and spraying what we see a lot of times spraying in like the substation. It is a total vegetation management company design. At least that's how I approach it, how I think if we're going to be competitive, we should all be approaching it. And so if I can offer that herbicide application in the substation where I'm a single vendor for them to go to spray the substation, spray the roadways, and along with that, if they need other work done on site, kind of the handyman, as long as I'm not cutting and splicing wires, I can fix a pothole. I can, get gravel moved where it needs to be. It really offers some additional revenue that maybe I didn't budget into the just grazing and mowing aspect of site management.
I'm going to comment on hay just a little bit. There is a project going on in Ohio right now. It's a big DOE grant project where they are exploring hay on a commercial site of over 100 acres. So that's going to be interesting to see their results. They're growing different types of hay, and then they're going to work with some machinery researchers and companies to be harvesting that over the next couple of years. So it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. Clearly, there are some logistical challenges to having that equipment in between those rows, et cetera. So we'll see how that plays out. But interesting new research that's happening there. Again, I think that probably isn't real possible at the current moment, but maybe in the future. So that'll be interesting to see. I want to ask one last question, and then we can finish up today. I want to ask a question about water. And I know I talked to Eric about his water situation, but others I would love to hear about Cameron's water situation, and how do we get water to these sites, and who's responsible?
Yeah, that's a great question. Before get into that, just want to touch have been to that DOE grant site to do the haymaking. And one thing, they're leaning heavily on technology and ag, and so GPS and managing that and some specialized equipment to fit. But one thing that I think is interesting on that, and I'm all for research and finding new opportunity, but you've got 1,000-acre site that they had to go back and bury wire on 70 acres so that they could actually carry out the haymaking side of that grant. And so even in our research aspects where they're getting millions of dollars to carry these out, to me, it proves the point that the industry is installing sites in a way that is most economical for them. My sheep I don't love sitting on a zero turn versus, a tractor and a bat wing. But my sheep don't care if there's wires there. They will graze under, around, walk around, graze the other side. So again, I think we need the research, and I think we have to look at everything. But even in a site that they knew they were going to make hay, they had to go back and retrofit to accommodate the equipment. The water thing, I feel bad I didn't mention it, because that is probably the I think single largest when we're grazing solar, one of the biggest things to navigate. Ideally, we have water on site and can haul from that water site to the sheep within the array. If that site does not have water access, we have to find it elsewhere, and that can be very difficult depending on where you're at in the US. It just varies state to state. That being said, if you're working with a good company, and that's my opinion, that company, if they are not able to get water on site for you, and it's their response, again, my opinion, their responsibility to have that on site for you, that they should understand that you are being compensated to haul that water. And that's one of the factors that goes into your bid. Certainly, again, regionally specific, we get down into Texas, maybe there's a retention pond that we can pump out of. And Eric might actually have a retention pond that he's watering out of. Some sites will have them, some sites won't. Ideally, if we're in an area where we could drill a well, or we're on some sites where county water exists, and all we have to do is that company paid for a meter, and they're paying that water bill for us. And then it's our responsibility to haul from that metered point to where the sheep are at on site. But yeah, water's a huge, huge thing. Yes, there's moisture and forage, but you need to have water out there for those sheep every day in every production stage.
So Cameron, this is Randy. I have one question also. How many producers do you guys need when you do your certification program? Is there a limited number you want, or? Like if we did one in Nebraska, what's the numbers you guys been working with in your certification for solar?
Yeah, so we try not to get too many over 30, just from a classroom management and interaction standpoint. So anywhere from that 20 to 30 range is a good mark. I know we've got one coming up in the fall of 2025 that'll be in Colorado, which is probably the closest location to you guys, or I mean, it's a wide state. So if you're in the eastern part of the state, maybe getting over to Illinois makes sense. But um, yeah, we have one in Colorado next year, and have worked with some other extension groups that they say, hey, we need this education, we need it early. Can you bring the curriculum here? We'll find you an office and find you the people, and looking forward to carrying those out as well.
Sounds good.
Then Eric, did you have any water points of discussion?
Yeah, I did. Just kind of on the conversation, you touched on it too, Cam. But one thing I think, especially the larger the site is, right, with a larger project budget, one thing that I have had some success with in the past is painting the picture to the solar company about what it's going to cost for me to haul water versus what it's going to cost for them to drill a well, and paint a really compelling picture that, you know, I'm kind of operating our water tables real high here, so a well's not going to be the same depth and cost that you probably run into in some parts of Nebraska. But I've had a pretty good time. When you look at a vegetation management contract that's 3 to 5 years long, and if it's going to cost you $50 an acre per year to haul water versus a $15,000 well, you can paint a pretty compelling picture to the solar company that might be better off just to drill the well on site or close by.
Very good. Well, thank you all for taking the time and joining us today. I'll be in contact via email with some materials. We'll get this recording up. As we're leaving, I think we're going to kind of end the webinar here today, but there was a last question if we want to just chat about it, and that was really about establishment. Basically thinking about how this site started off. Was it a cornfield? Was it a soybean field? Was it a pasture? And then how do we get that site to where it's grazable? And I know that there is some variability with respect to grading of the site at the time of building, where some sites may have very little soil movement while others might have more. And some of that's just how the philosophies of the developer. But any comments on establishing plant species?
Yeah, to your point on like grading it up to the company, there's definitely a big difference between sites that go in and flatten everything, and then sites that are companies that go in and say, hey, we want to set a 5% minimum on grading. And the fun thing, I think, is the technology and mechanics of tilting and tracking is changing so rapidly that there's very few instances where grading may be absolutely necessary, because the equipment can handle some slope and change in topography, which is something that I did not know would be possible, and changes your mind on where you can put these sites. But what I'm a big fan of, if that company is able to get in on that cornfield, that crop ground ahead of time, and pre-construction seed that into our grass, our legume mix, and then come through afterwards and just spread seed or get seed in places that maybe saw some damage from the construction phase of things. I do want to turn it over to Eric, because his site is not cornfield or pasture, and has posed its own set of challenges.
Yeah, and certainly something that you could still run into in Nebraska, but just for like some perspective on the greater, and every state runs into this to some extent, but the site that I graze, and many of the ones that I've grazed in the past, was a commercial pine plantation, so like loblolly type pine. that was, timbered, then grubbed, stumped, raked, root raked. There wasn't a lot of grading per se, but there was a lot of mechanical action. So one thing that I found on sites like that was even though the planted species or the species they were trying to establish, in some cases only about 50% of that actually came through. The other 50% in some of those cases was what was just basically in that native seed bank. So we see a lot of um, like the woody sapling species, sweet gums, uh, volunteer pines, some of those come back through. And then also a lot of some of the native marsh grass, needle rush, those types of things, Phragmites, what we have a ton of here, come through, so there was no intention to establish them, which makes they're normally more difficult to mow and then, less palatable to sheep. So just a consideration as you're walking through that site prior to bidding, to keep that in the back of your mind that some of it may not be grazable, even though there's vegetation there.
Yeah, I really appreciate your comment about trees as well. I've seen a little bit of challenges with volunteer trees in a few locations here. Because although there's not a lot of solar, there's a fair amount of small systems, and so a few experiences happening with those number of small systems that are 5 to 30 acres. Quite a few of those across Nebraska at the moment. Not a lot of big ones, but there is, and I had this in my slides that I messed up on, but there's approximately 50,000 acres of proposed projects in Nebraska. That won't probably happen, but maybe 10,000 that will in the next couple of years. And that's still a fair number of acres, and at least a handful of potential people that can get in on this from a vegetation management standpoint. And then maybe more to grow after that. So we're a little late to the game, but I think it's a growing piece of late to the game, and I think we're late to the game for a lot of reasons. But one of those probably is simply we don't have a large population here, and so the need for new power generation hasn't been as rapid. Also, the desire for renewables hasn't been quite as rapid as other places, so we haven't put some of those policies in place that drove some of that. So lots of things going on. I really appreciate Cameron and Eric taking the time to do this. We will follow up. I'm hoping to follow up with some more opportunities here in Nebraska in the next year or so. So I will definitely put everybody in that was on this webinar on a list to receive those updates. You won't get very many a year, just a couple. So, but you'll get some updates on what Extension's doing, and maybe there'll be some opportunity to collaborate. So thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful day.